Dear YouTube, in case you are investigating this video due to a complaint about hate speech or copyright violation, allow me to give the following assurances. Firstly, a word on copyright. If the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Pennsylvania is unhappy because I've used their propaganda in a way they disapprove of, please know that I am very familiar with copyright law and have ensured that any use of copyrighted material in this video falls within the fair use provisions, particularly as pertain to criticism and parody. Secondly, let me ease any concerns you may have about hate speech. Though I am unapologetically a critic of the leaders of Jehovah's Witnesses, I feel no hatred whatsoever when it comes to individual believers. I have even spoken out on occasion against the harassment and mistreatment of witnesses. Rather than being hateful, this video, and indeed my channel, represents my attempt at respectfully offering a helpful resource for witnesses who are beginning to think of their faith as false or harmful and would like to know the other side of the argument. Hello viewers, well it's time to take a look at the March JW broadcasting episode, which was hosted by governing body member Gerrit Lösch and governing body helper Leon Weaver. So without further ado, let's roll the first clip.
The theme for this month is, in whom do you trust? Do you trust me? I hope so. All of us want to be trusted. Trust is a basic element of everyday life. To trust others is a normal reaction. Many of us have traveled on a train or a bus. Did we worry whether the conductor or driver would bring us safely to our destination? Normally, we do not worry. We trust an airplane captain to take us safely to our destination. We trust that when we enter an elevator, that it will not crash at the bottom of the shaft, but safely take us to the desired floor. When we marry, we trust that our partner will remain faithful. In many situations in life, we need trust. What is trust? Trust is the firm belief in the reliability, truth, or ability of someone or something. Webster's dictionary says that it is confidence, a reliance or resting of the mind on the integrity, veracity, justice, friendship, or other sound principle of another person.
So in case you hadn't noticed, this month's episode is all about trust. And just in case none of you knew what trust meant, Gerrit very helpfully gives us the dictionary definition. This seems to be a recurring theme in broadcasting episodes where it's just assumed that the audience knows virtually nothing, so that everything needs to be explained and the definitions of very rudimentary words need to be revealed. So, trust. Now, I find this fascinating because there are lots of reasons why Jehovah's Witnesses shouldn't trust the governing body. One very obvious rebuttal I have to these opening comments by Gerrit Lösch is that it's all very well saying, well, I'm sure you all trust me. And, you know, there's plenty of reasons, as he goes on to explain, why you should trust the faithful slave. I would argue that trust needs to be earned. And with the governing body, you have a group of men fronting an organisation that has a proven track record of lies, deception, false predictions. Basically, they have shown themselves as an organisation, and specifically with the governing body as a group of leaders, to be unworthy of trust. And yet you have these examples given of a bus driver, an airplane captain, an elevator, and getting married. And these are all examples of where you would need trust. But again, if I get on a bus, I'm going to assume that the bus driver has had to go through some training. He hasn't just been randomly picked off the street by the bus company and put behind the wheel. He's had to, pass some tests. He's had to have his performance monitored. Same thing with an airplane captain. With an elevator, most elevators that are installed have to pass a series of tests, and the company is accountable legally if there's any problems. Where is the accountability when it comes to Watchtower? Where is the accountability when it comes to the governing body and its failed predictions and its covering up of abuse and its breaking apart of families and its urging of people to die rather than accept blood? To whom are they accountable? So that's my whole problem with the entire premise of this episode on trust.
In the world, many people are not trustworthy. Since we are living in the time of the end and the demons are desperate and have influenced many people, we have to admit that trusting in everybody is not wise. Many trusted in religion and were disappointed. Others trusted in governments or the United Nations, but they were disappointed. They trusted political leaders that made all kinds of promises but did not keep all of them. Some politicians even were exposed as being liars.
Okay, we're already into very dodgy territory here, Gerrit, because you are in no position at all to lecture about politicians being guilty of lying. And I've covered this before in my videos. If you're watching this perhaps as a Jehovah's Witness and you don't know what I'm talking about, I'm going to try and cover it as briefly as possible because frankly I'm tired of talking about it. But if you read my book, I talk about a statement that Gerrit Lösch made as part of the Jose Lopez child abuse case. It's actually a statement that's dated February 2014. And in this statement, I kid you not, this is a signed statement by Gerrit Lösch. He says, "I am not and never have been a corporate officer, director, managing agent, member, or employee of Watchtower. I do not direct and have never directed the day-to-day operations of Watchtower. I do not answer to Watchtower. I do not have and never have had any authority as an individual to make or determine corporate policy for Watchtower or any department of Watchtower. Watchtower does not have and never has had any authority over me." Could you imagine what would happen if a Jehovah's Witness stood up in a kingdom hall and said, "Watchtower does not have and never has had any authority over me"? Can you imagine what would happen if someone said something like that in a kingdom hall? And yet here is a governing body member, one of the faithful slave, who is, and the whole reason why he said all this, by the way, was because he was fiercely opposing the idea of being subpoenaed to give evidence in this court case. And in the end, he managed to get out of it. But here he is, fiercely denying having any role with Watchtower. And yet in this episode, not only does he have the gall to say, "Oh, well, politicians lie, but also he is co-presenting this episode with Leon Weaver, who is the president of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of New York. He is literally sitting side by side in parts of this video with the president of the New York Corporation of Watchtower. He is delivering a lecture or a speech that is part of materials that are being produced by Watchtower, and at the end of the video, the copyright notice at the end says Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Pennsylvania. And yet in a 2014 signed statement, he says, I don't have anything to do with Watchtower. I'm not responsible for them in any way, shape or form. Honestly, the deceit is astonishing and the hypocrisy is astonishing. And that is precisely why, ladies and gentlemen, no one should have any trust for the governing body, but especially for someone like Gerrit Lösch.
If somebody, even in the truth, promises us big monetary returns if we give him money for his planned investment, we need to be careful and not believe every word. Some that spent their money were in for a disappointment when they learned that everything was lost. We also should not trust everything we read in newspapers or see on television.
Okay, two things here. First of all, you have the repeated warnings to ignore what's said in the media, ignore what's said in the newspapers. Isn't that interesting? Doesn't that, or shouldn't that, raise red flags if you are one of Jehovah's Witnesses? If you are in an organisation that is saying, we'd rather if you just ignore some of what's written in the newspapers, if that's okay. You can't trust them. You can trust us. You can't trust what is said in newspapers. So that kind of speaks for itself. The other thing that's noticeable is when Lösch gives this warning about the perils of investing with brothers or investing with people who want your money in exchange for rewards further down the line. And he says lots of people have come to harm that way and they've been duped. Well, that's exactly what happens when you become a Jehovah's Witness. It may not be monetary, the promises that are made to you, but you are promised a great deal. You are promised eternal life in a paradise earth, and you're promised that this will happen in your lifetime. You're promised that you will live through Armageddon because the end is imminent. So provided you don't, die tragically beforehand, if you can keep yourself alive, you will live through Armageddon and you will see the realization of all these fantastic promises. And how many people have died of old age waiting for those promises that were made to them with great urgency, and they never came to fruition. But again, the governing body is accountable to no one. They don't have to explain things, do they? They just get to say, well, you need to have faith. You need to have trust in the faithful slave. Trust us. We may be imperfect, but if you just hang on, everything's going to work out right in the end.
There's another thing we should not trust in: riches. Psalm 49:6 speaks about those who are trusting in their wealth and who boast about their great riches. Trusting in riches often leads to disappointment. The one trusting in his riches will fall, says Proverbs 11:28. It is not wrong to be rich, just do not trust in riches. Riches are a risk factor.
So on the face of it, this seems like good advice. It seems fairly straightforward that you can't just put all of your trust in money and in riches. But I feel as though there is an underlying message here. First of all, you repeatedly hear, particularly in JW broadcasting episodes, this false dichotomy where you are either trusting in Jehovah by doing everything that Watchtower wants you to do, or you're trusting in riches. It's either one or the other. It's inconceivable from Watchtower's standpoint that someone could just be a good person and not want to follow the governing body or believe Jehovah's Witness teachings. They have to be, if they're not a Jehovah's Witness, they have to be greedy, they have to be selfish, they have to be obsessed with accumulating wealth. And the other kind of underlying message here, I feel, is about higher education, because that's another kind of stigma that gets loaded onto those who want to better themselves through going to college and university. This idea, oh, well, you're trusting in riches. Wouldn't you rather put your trust in Jehovah by pioneering and spending your life seeking first the kingdom? So, although on the face of it, it sounds very benign, very logical, very rational, there is an underlying message that is far more pernicious.
Jehovah created us with the inclination to trust. We can especially trust our spiritual brothers. True, once in a while such trust is misplaced. A few commit serious sins and have to be disfellowshipped, but that is rare.
It just didn't sit well with me, this part where Gerrit Lösch says that disfellowshipping is actually quite rare. And the point he's trying to make, which is a fair point, is that on the whole you can trust your fellow Jehovah's Witnesses because it's rare that they'll get involved in serious wrongdoing requiring disfellowshipping. Of course, when you think about the consequences of disfellowshipping and the fact that disfellowshipping results in having your family torn away from you, it doesn't sit well to hear a governing body member say, oh, well, it's quite rare that. Because if you're one of the people who's affected, and just to put this in perspective, if you go on jwfacts.com, Paul Grundy's done an article titled Disfellowshipping and Shunning, and in it says, for every 100 Jehovah's Witnesses, more than one is disfellowshipped each year, over 80,000, with 2 out of every 3 never reinstated. And actually, those figures are based on actual published statements in the magazine. So, for example, in the 1992 July 1st Watchtower, it says, in recent years, disfellowshippings worldwide have been approximately 1% of publishers. Now, 1% may not seem like a lot, 1 in 100, but if you are that 1 in 100, it's no consolation to be told, oh, well, what's happening to you is quite rare, if what's happening to you involves you being torn away from your family. So just quite insensitive, really, the way this whole part of the talk is worded.
Another example of trust was Abraham. When God told him to kill his beloved son Isaac, Abraham was willing to do so. He trusted that Jehovah could resurrect him. Hebrews 11:19 says, he reasoned that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, and he did receive him from there in an illustrative way.
I just can't get my head around the way that Watchtower continues to talk about the story of Abraham and Isaac as though it's this wonderful story. I think obviously I appreciate that lots of you watching this are believers. You are believers in the Bible. You respect the Bible as the inspired word of God. I cannot personally, though, find anything laudable in a story where a father is willing to murder his son because of voices in his head. Especially if you've ever actually been a father or a mother and you understand the profound love that you have for your child. How is it laudable? How is it laudable that Abraham was willing to go ahead and do it and was only stopped at the last minute? And the excuse given here is, oh, well, Abraham knew that God could resurrect Isaac, so it would all be okay. Well, first of all, this is the letter written by the Apostle Paul in Hebrews, so that's Paul's opinion. That's Paul, centuries later, apologizing for this story and trying to make excuses for it. Second of all, imagine that were true. Imagine Isaac was murdered, was sacrificed, and was later resurrected, he would have in his memory the memory of his father plunging a knife into him. That would be he wouldn't forget it, presumably. He'd still remember it, because otherwise, if his memories didn't count for anything, he wouldn't be the same person. So if you're going to resurrect someone with that memory of his father killing him, what's that going to do? What's that going to do psychologically to carry that memory around with you of your parent, of your father who you trust, plunging a knife into you? How do you deal with that, with having that memory if you are resurrected, which obviously is just hypothetical? So I just cannot understand why any religious organization in the 21st century would point to this story of Abraham and Isaac and say, well, this is a great story and we need to think about its message.
1 Corinthians 13:7 says that love believes all things. Love trusts that prophecies will come true. It also believes what our brothers tell us. It also helps to grant others the benefit of the doubt if a matter could be interpreted in different ways. Yes, trusting others is an expression of love. If you love somebody, you only assume and think the best of him.
This is a fantastic example of plucking a fairly innocuous verse out of the Bible that just says something very generic like, oh, love believes all things, and zeroing in on it and projecting it into all of these situations so that your narrative is supported. And you can say, oh, well, it says it here in the Bible. Gerrit Lösch is literally saying that if you don't believe him, that if you don't believe Watchtower, that if you don't believe the theology, the teachings that have been given to you as a Jehovah's Witness, guess what? You're not loving enough. Because apparently the more loving you are, the more gullible you'll be. And if you're not sufficiently gullible, if you don't sufficiently believe everything that you're told, if you don't give the benefit of the doubt when you hear horrendous stories about witnesses being involved with child abuse cover-ups, well, you're not being loving enough, actually, brother. And you need to go and think about whether you need to work on how much love you're showing to the organization. It's a classic example of an innocuous Bible verse being completely twisted to support Watchtower's narrative.
Another example of trust in Jehovah was Moses. He led the nation of Israel out of Egypt into the desert, a nation of upwards of 3 million people, and they had flocks of cattle and sheep with them. When he left Egypt, did he know how to provide these great crowds with water in the desert? Did he know what they would be eating after the initial foodstuffs that they took out of Egypt would run out? Did he know in advance that Jehovah would miraculously provide the manna? It doesn't seem so. But he trusted that Jehovah would take care of the people.
This is another story where I just cannot understand why it gets given so much attention. Because when you actually study the story, or if you know anything about the story and what happens next, I mean, apart from the fact that the Exodus story in the Bible is completely unsupported by archaeology. I mean, you could, I guess there's parts of history where it could be slotted in somehow, but bottom line, that particular period in history, if there had been an Exodus, if there had been 4 million Israelites that we didn't previously know about leaving Egypt, they would have been on a 40-year trek to get to another part of Egypt because at that time Canaan was under the control of the Egyptians. So it wasn't much of an exodus, was it? But even if we ignore all of the archaeology and ignore all of that and just put our implicit trust in everything that the Bible says about Exodus, you have 3-4 million people fleeing Egypt to go and wander in the Sinai wilderness for 40 years. And according to the Bible, the only ones who survive are Caleb, Joshua, and a few Levites. I'm not making this up. You can research this in Watchtower Publications. That's what the Insight volumes say about Exodus. So what do you take away from that? If you're trying to kind of promote this story as an example of how you trust in Jehovah, and isn't it wonderful that Jehovah supplied manna to these Israelites? These Israelites were on death row. They had gone through the Red Sea to die in the desert. And those verses that talk about the Israelites complaining and saying, oh, you've brought us here to die, we would have been better off in Egypt. Well, yes, they would have been better off in Egypt, because at least they wouldn't have been dying in the desert in those sorts of conditions. So I just, once you know about this account and what the full ramifications are of the story, I don't know how it's an account that you can boast about.
The 3 friends of Daniel were another fine example of trust. They did not bow and worship in front of an idol that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. They were told they would be thrown into a fiery furnace if they disobeyed. They remained firm and were protected by an angel, so the fire did not do any harm to them. After that, Nebuchadnezzar then declared, "Praised be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and went against the command of the king and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own God." As we are getting ever closer to the Great Tribulation, we might be confronted with scary challenges and tests related to nationalism. Will we keep trusting Jehovah? We trust we will. Jehovah will miraculously save his people throughout the Great Tribulation and arrange for their survival.
This was actually a very disturbing part of the broadcast, because it seems fairly innocuous at first. Gerrit Lösch talking about this story in Daniel of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refusing to worship the image, and they get thrown into a furnace, and an angel goes in and rescues them, and they're able to walk out of the furnace and they're okay. And the message that's given here, or the application of this, is that we should be willing, or witnesses should be willing, to be loyal to the death. And then immediately after talking about this Bible story, he starts talking about the Great Tribulation. And he says, oh, well, something similar could happen in the Great Tribulation. You could have a government that requires some form of nationalistic worship. And we've got to be willing to lay down our lives if necessary, rather than compromise our worship. There's a dangerous reasoning going on here, which is basically requiring witnesses to be prepared to martyr themselves if necessary. And if you think I'm exaggerating, all you need to do is research what happened in Malawi, where basically this played out. I mean, it doesn't bear thinking what happened to Jehovah's Witnesses in Malawi during the 60s, 70s, 80s. They were required by the single-party state. So a single-party state. There were no other parties. They were required to have a card saying that they supported the ruling party, which was the government. It was a card saying, we support the government. And Watchtower decided that it would be compromising the neutrality, the Christian neutrality, if witnesses were to have this card, which amounted, quite frankly, to a passport. I mean, a passport says, I'm a citizen of this country. And if you're in a single party state that says we want you to have this card saying that you support the ruling party, the government, that's basically what it amounts to. It's just a government ID card. And witnesses refused, and they were beaten, they were raped, they were murdered, and all the while in Mexico, an entirely different situation was allowed, whereby young witness men could bribe officials to get a special document called a cartilla, which said that they were part of the military, they were part of the military reserves, and only with this document were they allowed to travel, were they allowed to get employment and that kind of thing. And Watchtower allowed that to happen. But a completely different set of standards in Malawi, and what happened to the witnesses there doesn't bear thinking of. I plan to do a video on this in more detail in the future, but I just think it's worth pausing here and considering what the message is behind what Gerrit Lösch is saying. Because at first glance it's, oh yeah, we should be faithful like Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. No, it's more than that. Watchtower wants witnesses to be loyal to the death.
Today, the faithful slave was put in charge of providing spiritual food for God's people who number into the millions. The slave also shows complete trust in Jehovah that he will guide them with his Holy Spirit. What makes it possible for the faithful and discreet slave to provide precious spiritual food? I will give you insight and instruct you in the way you should go, says Jehovah. Psalm 32, verse 8. Today, Jehovah provides direction to the slave through Jesus. Jesus, in turn, provides direction for his people through the faithful and discreet slave. We can have, therefore, full confidence in the scriptural insight, understanding, and guidance.
What we've just heard is utter nonsense. So Gerrit Lösch is saying God chose the faithful and discreet slave to preside over millions of his worshippers. Evidence? None. There can be no evidence. To believe this, you have to believe that Jesus inspected all the world's religions invisibly between 1914 and 1919, and invisibly chose the Watchtower Society at a time before it was called Jehovah's Witnesses, and at a time when they believed some quite frankly ridiculous things. They believed that the Pyramid of Giza was God's stone witness, and didn't get rid of that teaching, by the way, until 1928. But in 1919, that was good enough for Jesus, and Jesus selected Watchtower to be his faithful slave. There can be no evidence for that. If you're going to believe that, quite frankly, you may as well believe in any religion. What's stopping you? If you're going to believe that, what's stopping you from being a Mormon and saying, oh, well, Joseph Smith found these golden plates and he interpreted them with a special stone, and, voila, he managed to uncover all of these lost texts that spoke of an ancient civilization, a Jewish civilization in the Americas. What's stopping you from believing that? Because you've just allowed yourself to believe that something happened between 1914 and 1919 that can't be proven. But Gerrit Lösch expects you to believe that, and furthermore says, oh, well, through Jesus, the faithful slave, and through Jehovah, the faithful slave receives direction and guidance and insight when it's teaching God's people. Well, we're now indulging in word games, because what the Watchtower publications say is that the faithful slave is guided by God and receives insight and direction from God, but it isn't inspired from God. And I would argue, what's the difference? If I guide someone to do something, what changes if I instead say, oh, I inspire someone to do something? You're just playing word games at this point. And the reason why they play these word games is because they know that if they use the word inspiration, they are then elevating what they're saying to the same level as the Bible, which can't be questioned. But they need to have at least an illusion of humility when it comes to their own writings, because they are repeatedly proved to be wrong. And as I've frequently argued, if God is guiding the governing body, if God is guiding the faithful and discreet slave, then he's also guiding the faithful and discreet slave to write things that are wrong, and to make wrong predictions, and to flip-flop on teachings, and to change its mind over things. You have to blame someone. And if Watchtower's going to say, oh, well, we're guided by God, well, apparently it's God who takes the blame then, because he's the source of all this nonsense, of all these failed predictions, of all these flip-flop teachings. So if you are a witness watching this, please think about that for a moment. Either God is behind this or he isn't. And if he is behind what Watchtower's writing and teaching, then apparently he's a liar, and apparently he's been trying to deceive and trick God's people for decades.
Satan tries to sow mistrust. Under communist dictatorship in Romania, secret police officers forced a responsible brother to walk with them on a heavily frequented street, hoping that other brothers would see this and wrongly conclude that this brother works with the secret police. Did the scheme work out? No, it failed. Brothers did see him, but kept trusting him. We learn that we should not quickly lose trust in our brothers.
Gerrit Lösch makes this statement, Satan tries to sow mistrust. And as evidence of this, as evidence of the fact that any kind of mistrust is more or less a product of satanic influence, he gives this story about something that happened, something that may or may not have happened in communist Romania, when some police tried to dupe witnesses by walking down the street with one of them. And that's his most compelling evidence that Satan sows mistrust, that there's this huge conspiracy going on in which the faithful slave is being sabotaged by Satan behind the scenes. The best story they can come up with to support this is some obscure anecdote about something that happened in Romania.
Satan also has the scheme to spread rumors about faithful brothers, including the faithful slave. The method of spreading rumors is not new. When Jesus was resurrected and the tomb was empty, the soldiers that reported it were told to spread the rumor that the disciples came and stole the body at night. Matthew 28:15 relates, "So they took the silver pieces and did as they were instructed, and this story has been spread abroad among the Jews up to this very day." Another rumor in the first century was that Christians were responsible for the great fire of Rome. Could such accusation be true? Historians say that it was Nero, the emperor, who set fire to the city. Today, rumors are occasionally being spread in electronic form about the faithful slave. This has caused some concern on the part of some brothers, especially when the reports are commenting on court cases where some in the organization were accused. Sometimes reference is made to certain quotes, and readers then think, how can a quote be a rumor? A quote can be taken out of context. Critical reports often give only part of a matter and leave out other aspects. Often such rumors play on the emotions.
So there's quite a bit to unpack here. You can fully understand why Gerrit Lösch is going down this road, talking about rumours, complaining about rumours, warning witnesses not to be taken in by rumours, even if it's a quote, he says. It could be an actual quote, but, quotes can be taken out of context. And this, again, is where we've already discussed his hypocrisy in calling out politicians who lie, given the fact that he has himself, there is documented evidence of him lying before a court of law. But he then, to try and kind of bury that almost, I can't help but wonder whether he's actually referring to that statement in the Lopez case. Well, I guess only he will know. But to try and bury that, he says, well, don't listen to rumours. And even if you hear a quote, just bear in mind it's probably been taken out of context. In other words, it's been misquoted. Again, you just have utter hypocrisy, because Watchtower are kings of misquoting. As I already mentioned, we talked about this in the November JW Broadcasting episode, which was hosted by David Splain, where he tries to present this image of Watchtower being very scrupulous and very careful to make sure all quotes are in context. And yet, if you go on the JW Facts article about misquotes and lies in Watchtower literature, you have literally a history going back decades of Watchtower doing precisely what Gerrit Lösch has just said, of taking words out of context to suit their own narrative. So the hypocrisy we're only 15 minutes into the broadcast at this point, something like that. And the hypocrisy already is just staggering. And you can see exactly why Gerrit Lösch is making these statements, because it seems obvious to me that Watchtower is on the back foot here. Watchtower knows exactly what's going on. They know that people are researching about child abuse, about the court cases, about the Australian Royal Commission. As much as they try to encourage witnesses to stick their heads in the sand, all it takes is one or two in a congregation and tongues will be wagging. So you can fully understand why Gerrit Lösch is trying to stigmatise rumour and trying to encourage witnesses to put their fingers in their ears and not listen, even if it's an actual quote from a governing body member like him saying, I don't have anything to do with Watchtower. No, it's probably been taken out of context. Let's give the brothers the benefit of the doubt. Nothing to see here, folks. Move along.
Ask yourself, am I prone to believe rumors? And even if I am, should I spread it and undermine the trust that others have in the slave or in representative of the branch office? Avoid sensationalism by saying something like, can you believe what I heard about this matter, or this person, or that person, referring to a statement that may have appeared on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter? The spread of rumors is like wildfire that is hard to control. It spreads distrust and can undermine someone's faith.
In this part of the broadcast, I was just like, yes, we've finally got, rather than just like a blanket statement about the internet or be careful about your use of social media, we're now getting names. We're now getting, be careful about using Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Be careful about what you hear in these places, and, just avoid them if you can. I love it. I really do love it, because human psychology, of course, tells us that if you tell someone not to do something, they just cannot resist. And I love the fact that we've already reached a point where the mass of information on the internet is so compelling and is wreaking so much havoc within the organisation, to the point where, despite JW Broadcasting despite Cart Witnessing, despite jw.org, Watchtower is floundering. With all of these new initiatives, which have been, promoted, and they keep lauding how productive these initiatives are, you would think that there would just be exponential growth in the organization. We're not seeing it. We're seeing stagnant growth numbers, especially in developed countries where they have Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And Watchtower knows all this, of course. And I just feel, in a way, privileged to be able to witness this kind of transition the Watchtower is going through, where they're starting to reach panic stations. And the fact that they can actually tell witnesses, just, be careful about YouTube, that's brilliant. Because you can bet that a large majority of witnesses will think, what is on YouTube? I'd better check that out.
This is not to say that the slave is perfect and never makes mistakes, but Jehovah and Jesus trust the imperfect slave who cares for things to the best of his ability and with the best of motives. Shouldn't we then trust the imperfect slave as well?
I realize I'm just going to be repeating myself, because we do unfortunately keep coming up against the same tired arguments again and again. They can only keep pushing the same old message. And in this case, the message is, well, the slave's imperfect. The slave makes mistakes, but they have the best of motives, and they've been chosen. Jehovah's put trust in the slave. So even if they're imperfect, and even if they make mistakes from time to time, just give them a cuddle and tell them how much you love them. Tell us how much you love us, and just do everything that we tell you to do. Because you know what? If you don't, we're gonna break you apart from your family. We're gonna tell your mother, father, son, daughter, brother, sister to never speak to you again. I mean, we're imperfect. We're imperfect, so we get it wrong from time to time. But we'd just rather, if it's okay with you, threaten you with family estrangement if you ever set foot outside of our spiritual paradise, if you ever believe something other than what we're telling you. But give us a cuddle, because we're imperfect. Honestly, how Orwellian can you get? You only get to talk about yourself in terms of being imperfect, in terms of making mistakes, when you are not punishing people with some of the worst forms of punishment imaginable for a human being, such as being separated from their loved ones. I'm sorry, Gerrit, it doesn't wash. It just does not wash. And the very fact that you are putting out this episode about trust shows that you have trust problems. I mean, how can you have 8 million Jehovah's Witnesses following you and believing you and trusting you when they are captive, when they have no other choice but to at least pretend that they follow you? Because if they don't do that, if they do speak out, if they do circulate rumors, you're going to end their families.
To appreciate the extent of Jehovah's and Jesus' trust in the faithful slave, reflect on what he has promised its members. He has promised them immortality and incorruption. Soon, just before Armageddon, the remaining members of the slave will be taken to heaven. Since 1919 of our common era, the slave has been put in charge of some belongings of Christ. According to Matthew 24:47, when the anointed are taken to heaven, Jesus will at that point entrust all his belongings to them. Does this not reveal immense trust?
Not really, Gerrit, because your entire argument here about the anointed being trusted and given immortality by God rests on the fact that you get to decide for yourself whether you're anointed. So literally one day, you, Gerrit, said, I've decided that I'm going to heaven. I'm going to be one of the 144,000. No one can prove that I'm lying. No one can prove that I'm deluded. I've said it, so therefore it's the truth. And it's exactly the same with all of the other governing body members. It's exactly the same with everyone who purports to be of the anointed, of the 144,000. We're just taking their word for it. There's no evidence. There's no process for establishing anything. And yet here Gerrit is saying, well, you can trust us because we trust, just believe me on this, we have been selected to rule in heaven as kings and priests with Christ over the earth. That's just true. That's just happened. So based on that, you can have absolute trust.
Revelation 4:4 describes these resurrected, anointed as co-rulers with Christ. Revelation 22:5 says they will rule not only for 1,000 years, but forever and ever. What immense trust Jesus shows toward them. Since Jehovah God and Jesus Christ completely trust the faithful and discreet slave, should we not do the same?
So if you've never been a Jehovah's Witness, maybe you follow my channel, you're just fascinated by Watchtower propaganda and what's going on with Jehovah's Witnesses, this is the point where I need to be a little bit boring and address something kind of nerdy about Watchtower teachings, because a few ex-witnesses I noticed were taking issue with this particular part of the broadcast, where Gerrit Lösch says that the anointed, the rulers in heaven, the 144,000, won't just rule during the first 1,000 years of paradise. After the millennium, after Satan and the evildoers have finally been vanquished at the end of that 1,000-year period, Gerrit Lösch is saying that the anointed will continue ruling, and for God to put so much trust in the anointed to allow them to do this just shows how much we should be trusting them, and specifically how much we should be trusting the governing body. And I've already explained why that's it's a very poor argument, because you're essentially just asking people to trust you when you say that you were chosen. You were among one of those who were chosen to be ruling in heaven. But a few have been saying that what Gerrit Lösch is saying here is not correct, or that it must be new light. They say that that's not something that Watchtower publications teach. I actually reached out to my friend Arthur Weber, who keeps a close eye on these things, and he furnished me with a reference to the 2012 January 15th Watchtower on page 30, where it says, by the end of 1,000 years of beneficial service, the royal priesthood will have elevated its earthly subjects to human perfection. As high priest and king, Christ will then present the completely restored human family to Jehovah. The royal priesthood will have fully accomplished its purpose. Thereafter, how will Jehovah use these highly privileged associates of Christ? According to Revelation 22 verse 5, they will rule as kings forever and ever. Over whom, the Bible does not say, but the quality of life that they possess and their experience in helping a world of imperfect people will equip them to hold a regal position in Jehovah's purposes forever. So that is what Gerrit Lösch has just said is actually an official Jehovah's Witness teaching, that the anointed, the governing body who consider themselves to be anointed, and everyone else who partakes of the emblems, and bear in mind that those who drink of the wine and eat of the bread at the memorial, Watchtower has already said of them, well, they might be a bit mentally unbalanced. We can't take it for granted that they are of the anointed, entirely missing the point that exactly the same thing could be said of the governing body. But never mind all that. The teaching here is that they don't just get to rule for 1,000 years, they get to rule on into infinity. It just hasn't been decided yet exactly how they will do that. So just a little nerdy point about Watchtower teachings, just to clarify that.
Many servants of Jehovah in the past showed trust in Jehovah when confronted with obstacles or opposition. We can trust that Jehovah will not let us be tested beyond what we can bear, but will provide a way out so we can remain faithful under trials.
It just grated at me when I heard Gerrit Lösch say this, because you do often hear witnesses say, oh, well, Jehovah won't allow us to be tested beyond what we can bear. And I can remember vividly my father saying this when my mother died. He was saying, oh, well, I must be able to bear it because Jehovah promises that he won't test us beyond what we can bear. And it just seems to me to be a very, it diminishes the significance when you are going through hardship. It's basically saying, oh, well, this is nothing. You've got this, you can deal with this, because we've been given this promise, when of course that sometimes humans can't bear it, when really awful things happen, when they lose people who are dear to them. Sometimes they can't bear it. And if you're struggling to cope with something, if you are going off the rails because something genuinely traumatic has happened to you, for it to be implied that it must be because you are somehow deficient with your faith, with your relationship with God, I think that's quite disgusting. I can see why it would only add to the trauma and to the heartache if you're in addition to dealing with something that's genuinely traumatizing, you're also indulging in self-loathing because you feel as though the very fact that you can't cope with it means that you're somehow deficient.
So, whom do you trust? You fully trust in Jehovah, Jesus, and the faithful slave. To a reasonable degree, you also trust all your fellow brothers and sisters.
I hope you noticed what Gerrit Lösch just did there. He said, we trust in Jehovah, we trust in Jesus, we trust in the faithful slave, the governing body, me and my mates. You're going to trust in us, aren't you? And to a reasonable degree, we trust in our fellow brothers. Why do we only apply reason? Why should witnesses only apply reason and logic when it comes to the amount of trust they put in each other? Why should they not also be applying reason and logic and trusting to a reasonable degree in the governing body? Isn't that interesting? So they've given themselves a free pass there, very cleverly, so that you almost wouldn't notice it. They've said, well, you can trust us as much as you would trust God and Jesus, and everything else you would only have trust to a reasonable degree. Very, very clever, subtle use of language to get across the governing body's message.
The writer of Psalm 119:42 mentions something else we need to trust in: God's word. He wrote, "For I put my trust in your word." The prophecies in God's word have always come true at the proper time. Based on that, we can trust fully that the remaining prophecies pointing to the survival of the Great Tribulation and to the paradise to follow will also come true without the slightest possibility of failure.
So Lösch is here saying that witnesses need to have absolute trust in the Bible, and specifically what the Bible has to say about the Great Tribulation and Armageddon. And isn't it wonderful that all of the prophecies in the Bible were fulfilled, and that means that the few remaining prophecies to do with Armageddon will also be fulfilled. Listen, you can, if you want, believe the Bible or consider the Bible to be God's infallible word. It's harder to do that when you actually do research into the Bible and what scholars have to say about the Bible, and all of the evidence that the Bible wasn't written when we think it was written, that it was actually written much later in history, and that books were tampered with and prophecies were written or included after the fact. It's harder to take the Bible seriously when you see what actual scholars who have devoted their lives to studying the Bible and trying to understand it, when you hear what they have to say. But even if you ignore the scholars, even if you just take the Bible at face value and assume that everything it has to say is valid and is inspired by God, that doesn't get you to Jehovah's Witnesses. That doesn't get you to, oh, well, there's this faithful and discreet slave that are actually the governing body and they're based in New York and they were chosen invisibly by Jesus between 1914 and 1919. That's not in the Bible. So even if you do put absolute trust in the Bible, that's not a reason to trust Gerrit. It's not a reason to trust the governing body. It's not a reason to trust Jehovah's Witnesses.
Of course, we should trust not only Jehovah, Jesus, the faithful slave, and the Bible, but also our fellow brothers. The Apostle Paul is a fine example of this. He wrote in Philemon, or to Philemon, asking him to kindly receive back the runaway slave, Onesimus, that had become a brother. Paul wrote in Philemon 21, I'm confident that you will comply, so I'm writing you, knowing that you will do even more than what I say.
This is another, frankly, fascinating example of appalling verses in the Bible being appealed to as though they're not appalling, as though they actually have a laudable message behind them. We've already heard the story of Abraham and Isaac, as though that was a great thing, that Abraham was willing to slaughter his son. We've heard about the Exodus from Egypt and about how 3 to 4 million Israelites went into the desert to die. That apparently was something that witnesses need to take strength from. And now we have the story of Onesimus, who proved that Christians were upholding slavery. That's something that, witnesses need to think about and draw a message from. If you're God and you're going to write a message to mankind, and you're going to instill your moral wisdom, surely one of the things that you're going to say is, listen, don't go owning each other. I'd really rather there wasn't such a thing as slavery. So just don't own other human beings if that's okay. But in Onesimus, in the book of Philemon, you have this story of Onesimus who ran away from his master, presumably stealing from him in order to run away. And he later encounters Paul, becomes a Christian, serves Paul, and Paul decides to send him back to his master because even though he's of use to Paul, Paul recognizes that he is still a slave, and therefore it should be for his master to decide. His master, who is a Christian, it should be for his Christian slave owner to decide what happens to the slave. So he sends him back to the slave owner and says, well, anything that this man owes you, I will pay, but you need to decide what you want to happen to this man. And actually, I'd really like it if you could send him back to me so that he can serve me on your behalf. So the chapter is talking in let's say, it's tolerating slavery. It's just accepting it. It's saying, well, this is how things are. Who are we to complain? Again, this is supposed to be a book inspired by a moral authority. We're supposed to view this as having come from a wisdom greater than ours. And yet it's talking about slavery in accommodating terms.
When we speak of trust, we sometimes think of a little child walking hand in hand with his father. The child does not question where the father will take him. The child trusts the father. All throughout the last days, true Christians have faced hostility of so many in the world. How strengthening Jehovah's promise is in view of the impending attack by Satan's hordes. When they attack, Jehovah's people will seem as defenseless, but we do not need to quake with fear. We trust that Jehovah, Jesus, and the angels will fight to deliver us.
This part for me perfectly sums up the relationship that Watchtower wants to have with Jehovah's Witnesses. The governing body wants Jehovah's Witnesses to be childlike, to be dependent on them for instruction in all areas of life. And that's precisely why we see micromanagement in all areas, whether it's entertainment, whether it's dress and grooming, whether it's who you're allowed to associate with. Watchtower assumes total control in all of these areas, and in order to do that, it needs to convince Jehovah's Witnesses that they are children, and therefore need to trust in them implicitly, because left to their own devices, they will be chewed up by Satan's hordes.
Today and after Armageddon, all can say, according to Psalm 26:1 and 52:8, I have trusted in Jehovah without wavering. My trust is in God's loyal love forever and ever. Therefore, keep trusting in Jehovah and those who are proving loyal to him. Back to you, Leon.
Thank you, Brother Lösch. In line with that, we all want good friends we can trust. The type mentioned at Proverbs 18:24, where it says, there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. But at times, we may find that a close friend needs spiritual help. Do we fear losing that friendship if we speak up? What does Jehovah want us to do?
Jehovah apparently wants us to snitch on our friends. That's what Leon is getting at this point. And it's just a fascinating part of Jehovah's Witness culture, because when you are a Jehovah's Witness, you're in this community, you have compulsory friendship, everyone is supposed to be your friend, you're supposed to extend brotherly affection to everyone and cultivate friendships, cultivate relationships. But first and foremost, your loyalty and your affection is for the organization, is for Watchtower. And what that means is that you essentially become an informant on everyone in your congregation, including your closest friends, so that if they ever do anything that strays away from the micromanagement I was talking about a moment ago, if they do anything that Watchtower disapproves of, well, first and foremost, your loyalty is to Watchtower and you need to snitch on them, which is precisely what this dramatization is about.
I had a secret. Only, it wasn't mine to tell. It was my best friend's, Julian. This was not the Julian I knew.
So I was trying to figure out what it was that Julian had done that his friend was so troubled by. And you see him looking at his phone and at the pictures, and as far as I can tell, Julian's crime is that he went to a party with worldly people. That's his crime. I mean, I'm not seeing anything. I mean, it could be that there's supposed to be more to it than that. But at least as far as this dramatization's concerned, what Julian is guilty of is having friends who aren't Jehovah's Witnesses and partying with them. That apparently is something that is really, really dangerous, and something that Julian needs to have dealt with by the elders. And that's the whole point of this dramatization, is Julian's friend dealing with this dilemma of, do I snitch on my friend or not?
A few years ago, when my parents stopped attending meetings, Julian was there for me. I didn't want to lose my friend, but did I really know him?
So now we're getting a bit of backstory. It turns out that this kid, his parents stopped attending meetings, and when that happened, it was Julian who reached out. It was Julian who showed love and friendship. But the lad is saying, oh, but do I really know who Julian is anymore? So he has this dilemma. But what's interesting is that we just saw a clip of Julian, of the two lads having a Bible study with a woman, and the woman is wearing a head covering. So maybe you picked up on that as well. I mean, the reason why women are supposed to wear a head covering in that situation is to recognize the headship of the male. So even though they are teaching, even though this woman is teaching to younger men, she is supposed to acknowledge the fact that they are her spiritual head because of their gender. And to acknowledge that, she has to wear her head covering. So I hope maybe you picked up on that as well.
I decided to ask Julian about the pictures he posted. I told him it wasn't right. He needed to talk to the elders. Then he got really defensive about it. I knew I did the right thing.
When was I supposed to take care of this bill?
I just needed someone to talk to.
When did you tell me? I've been working.
So now we have the part where Julian is confronted and he's told that what he's doing is wrong. The implication being that he needs to go and get help. He needs to approach the elders and get their guidance because he's strayed by having friends who aren't in his cult and partying with them. We all know how evil that is. But this part of the story is interesting because basically what we've seen is a threat, or at least that's in other situations that would crop up, especially if it was something more serious. A witness is supposed to say, here's the deal, you go to the elders and you confess what you've done to the elders, and if you don't, I will. So then they have this deadline where they have to go and confess to the elders to get spiritual help, and if they don't, the elders will learn of it anyway. So basically an ultimatum. And that's how it works in a Jehovah's Witness congregation. And if I can understand how, if you are a believing Jehovah's Witness, you'd be nodding along with this, and you think, oh yeah, that's right. You know, the lad did the right thing there, and that's how I would do it. But if you're watching this as someone who's never been a Jehovah's Witness, what you're watching is total paranoia, total guilt tripping, and fear-mongering over a kid who has been to a party with his friends. How on earth will this look to anyone that hasn't, for years or even decades, been indoctrinated to think that Watchtower is Watchtower as spokespersons for God, and that doing anything outside of what Watchtower requires will put you in serious spiritual jeopardy.
Brother Max wanted to know how I was really doing. He could tell something was wrong. So, I opened up. I told him everything. I didn't want to get my friend in trouble. Max understood. He asked me to read James 5, verses 14 and 15. Is there anyone sick among you? Let him call the elders of the congregation to him, and let them pray over him, applying oil to him in the name of Jehovah. And the prayer of faith will make the sick one well, and Jehovah will raise him up. Max showed me that the elders can encourage and strengthen a spiritually weak person. Covering up a friend's wrongdoing prevents him from getting the spiritual help he needs. All this time, I was focused on Julian and his deception, and I didn't speak up. I'm glad I was honest with Brother Max. The elders are like our spiritual doctors, and even more, they're our friends. They want to help us. Julian might receive discipline, but that's an expression of Jehovah's love. It could save his spiritual life.
How do you sit through this with a straight face? The kid went to a party and he's being treated like he's killed someone. I just don't understand how the writing department or whoever came up with this could think, yes, this is something we need to put in our JW broadcasting episode, and it won't at all make us look like a controlling cult.
When you think about entertainment today, it's nearly impossible to try to find something that is acceptable to Jehovah that does not have immoral sex, pornography, spiritism, and violence. Satan has thoroughly saturated all forms of the media, so thoroughly that it's in our literature, it's in movies, it's in electronic games, or everything that we can think of, Satan has infiltrated.
So here the message is that Satan has saturated the world's entertainment with spiritism and sex and immorality and the occult, and that it's nearly impossible to find entertainment that isn't strewn with this sort of thing. And the end product of this, not only does it illustrate, of course, how controlling Watchtower is in insisting that they should have a say in what movies witnesses watch, what TV shows they watch, what books they read. It also shows the level of fear-mongering, and what happens is that a witness will watch this, and the message that they get is, you know what, I better not watch anything. I'd better basically scale down my movies to basically just Pixar animations, because that's the only thing that's safe. And even Pixar animations I should be careful with, because they might try to sneak in witchcraft or sex. So it really is quite tragic, the effect that this kind of extreme language has on witnesses.
Obey Jehovah completely. Jesus always did things that were pleasing to his Father. Luke 22:42 said, "Let not my will, but yours take place." Remember, there's no substitute for obedience. We cannot be acceptable without obedience.
Yes, when you're following a cult, there really is no substitute for obedience.
Listen, obey, and be blessed. When you hear God's will expressed.
Well, we cannot afford to take shortcuts. We need to have a regular intake of spiritual food to keep pace with Jehovah's organization. We do this by what the commenters told us today. That is a regular intake of God's word and meditation. As we run the Christian course, the race for life, remember, it's not the speed, it's the direction. That's what matters the most. And may we always run in such a way that is acceptable to Jehovah.
As Brother Curzon mentioned, certainly a regular intake of God's Word can have a dramatic effect on our lives.
So yes, witnesses are reminded there to have a regular intake of spiritual food, and the emphasis being, of course, on regular. It needs to be daily, on a daily basis. They need to do their Bible reading, they need to do their day's text, they need to be preparing for the meetings that week. And I've talked about this before, but the repetition, you really need repetition when you're in a cult, because none of it makes sense otherwise. You can only be persuaded to believe total nonsense if you're being indoctrinated with it and reminded of it day after day after day. If it's fact, if it's verified fact of the kind that you would be taught in a school or college, people don't need to go to college for the rest of their lives. People don't need to go to school for the rest of their lives. People don't need to go to university every day for the rest of their lives, because once you learn something that's factual, that can be substantiated, you don't need to keep being reminded of it. But when it comes to cult indoctrination, when it comes to spiritual food, you need that every day. And the reason is because if you don't have it every day, you'll realize that it's a load of nonsense.
Growing up in the South, during the time of segregation, blacks and whites, we couldn't mix. And not only that, they had signs to keep you knowing where you're supposed to go. I couldn't understand why we couldn't get along.
50 cent?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Grandma, he's just a boy. Why are you saying sir?
Be quiet. I want you to know your place.
So this is interesting. We're now getting the story, the testimony of Rafika Morris, who is talking about basically how her experience with segregation and with racial inequality drove her eventually to join the Witnesses after seeing the failure of human efforts in bringing about equality. And the testimony starts off with this reenactment where a young Rafika goes with her grandma to presumably hand over the cotton they've been picking, and they're forced to show deference to this young white kid just because he's white. I just find it fascinating that, well, Watchtower will have had to devote considerable resources to filming that scene. If you know anything about what goes into video production, you look at that set, you look at the costumes, the location, that will have required quite a lot of planning and quite a lot of resources just to get across the fact that when Rafika was growing up, she experienced segregation and she experienced racial inequality. Now, don't get me wrong, it's great that Watchtower is sending out this message that this is wrong, but it would be far more compelling coming from an organisation that didn't itself have some involvement in segregation. And I'm saying this mindful of the fact that a lot of you watching this who perhaps are Jehovah's Witnesses or you don't know much about Watchtower history, you'll think, what on earth is he talking about? Because Jehovah's Witnesses are one of the least racist organisations or religions that you could conceive of. I mean, it's everywhere. It's in the depictions of paradise. It's in the imagery that you see at the assemblies of people of different races and nationalities coming together. But it wasn't always that way. And one of the best examples of when Watchtower was far more backward in its view about racial equality comes from the Watchtower back in 1914, specifically the April 1st, 1914 Watchtower, where it confesses that during a screening of the photodrama of creation, bear in mind the photodrama was released in 1914, During one of the screenings in New York, the audience was segregated. So the black audience members were sent to a different part of the auditorium because it was considered that by that mingling them with other audience members, that the showing would suffer, that people wouldn't want to watch it. And I'm just going to quote to you a little bit from the article. It says, as the attendance of the coloured people would increase, proportionately the number of whites would decrease. For explain it how we will, a majority of whites prefer not to intermingle closely with other races. Recognizing that it meant either the success or the failure of the enterprise of the drama as respects the whites, we have been compelled to assign the coloured friends to the gallery, which, however, is just as good for seeing and hearing as any other part of the temple being the theatre. Some were offended at this arrangement. Imagine turning up to watch the photo drama of creation as a black Bible student back in 1914 and being herded like cattle into the gallery section purely because of the colour of your skin. That is segregation at its worst. It was a part of Watchtower history. And so, well, what Watchtower needs to do is own up to that and apologise for it and acknowledge that that is what was happening back then, but to not only ignore it, but to also put out this kind of propaganda that we're seeing now, where it's basically pretending that it's always been against segregation, is extremely disingenuous. And I couldn't help but watch this and see the manipulation and dishonesty in what Watchtower's doing here.
I used to pray, what makes us so different? You know, why we can't live together? I met a group, and this group was like what I really wanted to be in. It was about politics. They said, we fight injustice. And when they said that word injustice, it was like, yeah, this is what I want to be in, right? Be part of something that can change and make people united, right? That was my goal. We started protesting about police brutality. And I think that's what a lot of people, you know, was focusing on. I liked some of the things that they was doing. But they trained us every day in military training, learn how to use weapons and stuff like that. And so I'm thinking like, this is not what I want to be in. This is not what I enjoy. So I started like going back to God again, to reading the Bible, because it's like, I'm not changing anything.
So presumably here Rafika is referring to the BPP, the Black Panther Party, that was active through the 60s and 70s. And the whole point here is to denigrate the role of human efforts in bringing about equality. Now, it could be argued, I mean, I'm not an expert when it comes to the BPP, so I don't really know what role they had, if any, in the civil rights movement. But one thing that you absolutely cannot deny is that the civil rights movement and the likes of Martin Luther King had a massive impact on American society and by extension around the world, because it was that kind of action, and it was that kind of driving of the discourse that made it so that the government had to stand up and take notice. And the result of that is a society today where, even though there is still injustice and even though there is still enormous inequality that still sadly needs to be dealt with, the situation is at least better than it was in, say, the 30s, 40s, 50s. The irony is that not only did human political action have an effect, it also had an effect on Jehovah's organization. Because after the civil rights movement, we stopped seeing overtly racist things being printed in the literature, we stopped seeing segregation, and we started seeing the racial equality that witnesses are accustomed to today. So I couldn't help but point out that false message in this part of the propaganda, which is saying that human efforts are useless, when history bears out that that's simply not the case. And in fact, it was human efforts, human political efforts, the civil rights movement that arguably had the biggest role in making Watchtower less racist in its publications.
The Bible that I was reading was the King James Version. So I was reading it, but I couldn't understand it. We went to Jamaica and I saw this Bible, the New World Translation. And I started reading it and it made so much sense. I could understand it and it wasn't thee and thou. I was like, wow, like this is the one I want to get. One day, 2 women knocked on the door. I didn't know they were Jehovah's Witnesses. All I could see was a Bible. And I said, where did you get the Bible from? And they said, well, okay, we'll bring you one. And they did. So they brought me the Bible, but I didn't know I was going to have a Bible study come along with it. The first time I went to a convention of Jehovah's Witnesses, it was like 10,000 people. When I go in there and I see all these different faces and different colors, it's like Jehovah's showing me like, hey, Rafika, remember you asked me about all different people getting together and being one? See, I'm not partial. They do get along. We are unified. And it just made me feel so good inside. Yes, this is the organization that I want to be in.
So that's the part of the testimony that we're by now used to, where there's this emotional revelation and the person realizes that they've been wasting their time all along, and if they'd only have been involved sooner with Jehovah's Witnesses, they'd realize that this is a unified organization that fulfills all of their wildest dreams. Well, the unity, we know now where the unity comes from. The unity comes from threatening people with shunning, with family estrangement, if they don't go along with what the leaders are teaching. I'd also be interested to know what year Rafika started attending the meetings and conventions, because it wouldn't surprise me if it was in the build-up to 1975, and we all know why people were flocking to Jehovah's Witnesses in those years. But bottom line, the reason why Rafika got involved with Jehovah's Witnesses is because she happened to get hold of a New World Translation which she could understand in comparison to the archaic language in the King James Version. And as she admitted herself, she wasn't expecting that she would also need to receive a Bible study when she encountered the group that was behind the New World Translation. None of that is a reason to get involved with Jehovah's Witnesses. You don't get involved in a religion because they've managed to come up with a translation of the Bible that you can understand, but that's apparently the message here.
I just see people as people, and I can preach and be friends with anybody. Now that I know what the Bible really teaches, I have a wonderful life. Because I know that only God and His government can bring about peace. Just like how Jehovah unified everybody, I would like for everybody to be unified and come to know Jehovah, just like I know Him. Jehovah answered my prayer.
Only God and His government can bring about peace. Of course, in that statement, you don't have the small print that says, by committing unfathomable genocide on a global scale. So basically, everyone that doesn't want to be involved in this government or doesn't see any rational reason to relinquish their decision-making ability to a bunch of leaders in New York, anyone who isn't a Jehovah's Witness deserves to be annihilated. And that way we can have peace, because all of the troublemakers have been killed. We've killed them. We have peace as a result of the biggest act of violence the universe has ever known.
And we shall have Since the end of this system is near, I want to do whatever I can that Jehovah wants down to the very end. So I applied.
Before attending SKE, when I received my invitation, all of a sudden I had challenges or worries about myself. I felt unworthy, even unqualified. Something that I really enjoyed about SKE was Friday afternoons. That's when we had a talk from one of the governing body members. That was special.
During the 8 weeks of school, such an emphasis was placed on serving where the need is greater. So this way of thinking became more important to us.
After 8 weeks attending the school, you are even ready to be sent to the moon.
The education that we received at SKE, especially it helped us with our qualities, our personality, putting on a new personality. That really will help us not only now in our assignment, but right through into the new world.
You could be nervous and have performance anxiety and worry about how will I handle answering? And how about all of the student assignments and the test? Worries like that. But for my own part, it was 2 months with an incredible amount of joy. And you have to focus on that. It is a gift. It is a wonderful gift from Jehovah.
I'm happy that I just put my application in and let Jehovah do the rest. And now sometimes I'm driving down the freeway and I think, wow, Jehovah, I'm so happy. Thank you.
So I couldn't resist just including those clips about SKE, or the School for Kingdom Evangelizers, which is an 8-week course now for married couples, single brothers and single sisters, but it's basically the latest iteration of the ministerial training school, which I went to in 2005, and back then it was just for single men, single brothers, but they've since expanded it, to their credit, to also be accessible to women. But I just couldn't help but smile at some of the things that were said there, because the message that's given is, oh, well, it's just this huge privilege. You know, we're not really worthy to be taught and instructed on this level by the governing body, and it's amazing what skills you learn, and you're even equipped to go to the moon if necessary. Having been through the school myself, I think when I look back with fondness, more as a result of the kind of camaraderie that you have with your fellow students, because it is hard. That the 8 weeks are very draining on you in terms of the amount of time that's involved with studying and doing the coursework and trying to remember things that, again, don't make any sense. But what gets you through is the camaraderie with other students. So even though I know essentially the whole thing was a waste of time, I still can't help but look back with fondness on the school. But I certainly don't think, oh wow, I was given this amazing gift by the governing body, because the whole point of schools like that is just basically to make you more useful to Watchtower. So by going through this intense training, all of these people are then more valuable to Watchtower as those that can go out into far-flung territories and try to draw in other people to Jehovah's Witnesses.
Go on, don't be afraid, hold on to what Jehovah says. Through all the storms, your words have given me strength to endure, and every day I am more confident in you.
So yes, it's time for this month's music video. And what can I say? I'm afraid it's the same kind of cringe fest. This time, the whole point of the song seems to be to encourage witnesses to endure despite facing certain challenges. And the next challenge that we're going to see is quite interesting.
When this world tries to pull It takes time to meditate, get the words from off the page, and in my heart so they can help and guide me to go on. Don't be afraid, hold on to what Jehovah says. Look beyond any adversity, focus on the things that I can't see. Through all the storms, your words have given me strength to endure.
So I don't know if you were following what was happening there, but what essentially happened was this young witness sister was shown with a work colleague who was helping her fix the printer, which wasn't working. And then the work colleague passes her an envelope, and in this envelope is a ticket to the aquarium. I mean, what is it with Watchtower's fixation with aquariums when it comes to people trying to express romantic interest in other people? We saw the same thing, by the way, in the leaked elder training videos from 2014.
I guess I should have seen it coming. Anyway, we ate and had a couple of drinks. She was witty and seemed very wholesome and nice. I guess I just let my guard down. The next thing I know, she's inviting me to see this aquarium in her apartment. I wonder how many times she's used that line.
I just can't understand what this weird fetish with aquariums is. Surely there's someone on Watchtower's writing committee who he's got some issues. But anyway, going back to the music video, this sister is given tickets to go to the aquarium, which then gives her this huge dilemma, of course, because witnesses aren't allowed to date non-witnesses. So she goes and does her Bible reading and studies and reads articles about how she's not supposed to do this. And long story short, she returns the invitation and explains to her work colleague that she won't be taking him up on his offer. But again, what a perfect way of highlighting to non-witnesses how controlling this religion is. If you're a Jehovah's Witness watching this, all of this makes perfect sense, and you're just thinking to yourself, well, the Bible says don't become unevenly yoked with a non-believer. But when you're watching this as someone who hasn't gone through that indoctrination, you're thinking, oh, okay, so this organization is telling me that I'm not allowed to date a non-believer. That's interesting. There are no red flags there at all.
Go on, don't be afraid. Hold on to what Jehovah says. Look beyond any adversity. Focus on the things that I can't see. Through all the storms, your words have given me strength to endure. And every day I am more confident in you.
So what we've just seen is the end of the music video, and actually this is the last clip of the broadcasting episode that I'm going to play. But I want to linger on this a little bit because there's a part of this clip. Essentially what we're seeing here is a witness lady who receives some very bad news. We don't know what bad news it is, but she receives some crushing news, and then she returns to the hospital and hands her doctor a publication, some kind of leaflet or document that's produced by a watchtower. And as a result of that, things start to somehow look more positive for her. But honestly, when she handed over the document, I didn't recognize what the document was. So I conferred with my colleague at JW Survey, John Redwood, and he did some digging, and you can actually find this document on jw.org. It's called Religious and Ethical Position on Medical Therapy and Related Matters. It's actually a fascinating document because I was only just talking about how controlling Watchtower is in terms of dating, and about how witnesses have their lives managed by being reminded that they're not allowed to date anyone who isn't a witness. In fact, in this episode, we've also seen advice to the effect that you're not allowed to go to parties with non-witnesses. But if you want a classic example of the extent to which witnesses have their decisions made for them and their lives managed for them, I would recommend downloading this document. I'm going to put a download link in the description below. It makes for fascinating reading, and I feel as though I need to do more on this document in the future. I don't know how yet. But just to give you an example, it has a paragraph on birth control, contraception. The scriptures do not prohibit birth control. Married couples privately and responsibly determine if they will employ appropriate methods of family planning. However, witnesses reject contraceptive methods that are abortive. So you would think that with birth control, surely there's not going to be any laws or requirements there. Well, there's certain types of birth control that you can't have as a Jehovah's Witness. Blood fractions. The religious understanding of Jehovah's Witnesses does not absolutely prohibit the use of fractions derived from the primary components of blood, such fractions as albumin, immunoglobulins, clotting factors, and hemoglobin solutions. Now, this, of course, I don't want to get sidetracked into a lengthy discussion on the blood issue, but in fact, I want to do a separate video on that at some point. But suffice to say that when you look into the fractions teaching, which came about in 2000, by the way, so in 2000, the governing body said, well, you're still not allowed to have a whole blood transfusion, but we will allow you to have fractions from the four main components of blood, which they determine to be red cells, white cells, platelets, and plasma. Now, just to give an example, or two examples rather, of just how ridiculous this fractions rule is. Red cells, if you look on the document, it says fractions from red cells that are allowed include hemoglobin. Now, what a red cell is basically hemoglobin in a wrapper. You have this disc that contains the hemoglobin, and it's the hemoglobin that is the protein that transfers oxygen through the body. It basically, if you could think of one thing that the blood does most crucially in terms of oxygenating the body, it's hemoglobin that does it. It makes up a large percentage of your actual blood, and the reason why your blood is red is because of hemoglobin. And Watchtower is saying here that if you could somehow get the hemoglobin out of its packaging in its raw state, in which it can act as a poison, if you just inject someone with hemoglobin without the wrapper, that it's naturally coming, it can be poisonous, it can do harm. But Watchtower's saying that that's okay. It's okay if you can get the hemoglobin out of the red blood cell and use that separately, that's okay. You've still got it from the blood. you still couldn't have it without someone donating blood. But no, you're allowed to have hemoglobin. It's just outrageous. And on the other side, you see plasma and fractions from plasma. And at the bottom of that list, it says that witnesses are allowed to have immunoglobulins. Now, in my book, The Reluctant Apostate, I just want to read you a footnote that I put together about immunoglobulins. We can be grateful that in allowing gamma globulin injections, Watchtower so readily ignores its strong stance against the harvesting of blood. As Ray Franz notes in Search of Christian Freedom, to produce sufficient gamma globulin for one injection by syringe, a vaccination persons, including Jehovah's Witnesses travelling to certain southern countries, may take as protection against cholera, close to 3 litres of blood are needed as the source of supply. This is still more blood than is generally employed for a common blood transfusion. And again, the gamma globulin is drawn from blood that is stored, not poured out. According to a 2005 medical paper titled Clinical Uses of Intravenous Immunoglobulin, intravenous immunoglobulin, IVIG, another name of gamma globulin, is a blood product prepared from the serum of between 1,000 and 15,000 donors per batch. So in order to make immunoglobulin, which is one of the things that witnesses are allowed to have according to this document that's shown in this music video, you need between 1,000 and 15,000 blood donors. And they harvest all of this blood, and from this they extract the immunoglobulin. But that's allowed, apparently, even though Watchtower insists that the only acceptable use for blood is for it to be poured out on the ground. They are allowed, they have made these kind of exceptions. Honestly, none of it makes sense. And the more you look into the blood teaching, the more baffled you get, quite frankly. Not that I'm complaining that witnesses are allowed these fractions. I would much rather witnesses had a fighting chance of living when they have life-threatening issues come up. But even so, the blood teaching makes no sense at all. And at some point when when I've got the stomach for it, I'll do a more detailed video on it. I just want to also mention, I mean, again, it's a fascinating document, and I would recommend that you take a look at it if you can. But there's an interesting, 2 more interesting sections I want to mention. There's a section on decision making and informed choice, where it's talking about the refusal of blood transfusions. And at the end of that section, it says, parents have the natural and legal right to make such decisions for their minor children. So it's arguing that parents should be able to deny their children a life-saving blood transfusion, even though there's no way that the child can understand the religion for themselves or be in a position to consent to having its life ended for those reasons. And on the subject of in vitro fertilization, I know a lot of you will remember the whole Pillowgate thing, where it was almost comical the lengths to which Watchtower was going to define its policy on porneia. You'll be fascinated to know that according to this document, the porneia rule is even more complicated than what Watchtower has expressed in its publications and videos, because there's even certain forms of fertilization techniques that would constitute porneia. So it says here, witnesses view in vitro fertilization, where the egg and sperm are derived from individuals who are not married to each other, as comparable to adultery and thus unacceptable. Gestational surrogacy is also unacceptable. So there are more ways to commit porneia than simply touching each other. You can also commit porneia by donating to someone an egg or a sperm for the purpose of fertilization. So another little FYI, a fun fact regarding Jehovah's Witness rulemaking. But again, this is a fascinating document. I'll put a link for you to download it and see for yourself the extent to which witnesses have their lives, their medical decisions controlled for them. But that brings me to the end of my comments on the March JW Broadcasting episode. Obviously the overriding theme was of trust, was reminding witnesses that they need to have implicit trust in the governing body. The most fascinating part, I think, was where Gerrit Lösch was telling witnesses not to spread rumours and not trust the media and to ignore what's said on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. I find it genuinely exciting to see Watchtower squirming in this way, to the point where it's naming names and it's naming websites that it doesn't want witnesses to go on, or that it wants witnesses to limit their use of. Very exciting times, and I'm really looking forward to seeing just how desperate Watchtower gets in the months and years ahead. But those were my thoughts on the March JW Broadcasting episode. Please don't forget to subscribe for more videos if you have found this rebuttal interesting. And as always, thank you for watching.